Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our World Interfaith Harmony Week program. I'm Reverend Dr. J. Speights, the Executive Director of the New Seminary. For those of you that don't know, the New Seminary was founded in 1979 by what I call an act of communion. A rabbi, a Kabbalic rabbi actually, a Swami Satchidananda, who brought yoga to the Western world. The rabbi's name was Rabbi Joseph Gelberman, and a Catholic priest and a Protestant minister. They came together to found the New Seminary, and what I believe was it coincided with the upswing of the moral majority, evangelicalism, and the election of Ronald Reagan. And I don't believe that they came together just to start a seminary. I think it was a response to what was going on spiritually and politically in the environment. And they founded it to first ordain ministers that had a connection to the global community from all faith traditions to come together to learn about the traditions of the other, and then to take the higher principles of each of those traditions and apply them in their lives, ministry, and spiritual practice. We have graduated close to 4,000 ordained ministers, and our work continues today. The theme for this, well, first of all, let me say, I'd like to give thanks to King Abdullah II of Jordan for his vision of World Interfaith Harmony Week, as well as the UN. And I would consider this real ecumenism. By real ecumenism, I mean an expanded sense of the ecumenical vision beyond Christianity. It's also important that traditional leaders like the King, His Majesty, are playing a role on a global stage to bring the faith communities together, because often traditional leaders have more power than those in government. I can speak to that firsthand, as I am a prince of a kingdom, and we take upon ourselves under our king to make sure that the various faith traditions work together. In fact, we have a traditional house of worship in Bodun directly across the street from a Christian house of worship, and the people go back and forth to each. So this is a beautiful concept, World Interfaith Harmony Week. And I think it's unparalleled in terms of what it does to build the global faith community and bring about the beloved community. I'd like to thank Dr. Nelson for pulling together this distinguished panel and speakers throughout the day, which include, I'm actually very happy to have Reverend Dorsey Blake here. And if you're a seminarian at our institution, you would know the name Howard Thurman. He informs much of what we teach. And the New Seminary used to say that they were the first interfaith organization, but actually it is the fellowship, the People's Fellowship in San Francisco, founded by Dr. Thurman. And Dr. Blake is his handpicked successor by the family, and stands in his pulpit, and even, I understand, sometimes wears his robes, if I'm not mistaken. And so what an honor and pleasure it is to have him here, as well as Reverend Jim Webb. I guess he'll be on speaking later. For those of you that don't know him, he started me on my path of ministry when I was a worship leader like Dr. Nelson at the Tacoma Park Metaphysical Chapel. And then I went on to the seminary, the New Seminary. He recommended me to go to the New Seminary, but he meant all faiths, actually. And it wasn't until a year later that he found out I was in the wrong seminary. But God has his ways of working. And Dr. Claire, thank you, Dr. Claire Nelson, for pulling this together. And thank you for all the students and supportive people from other seminaries and institutions that are here to day. And we also have J.Jioni Palmer, who is a good friend, lifelong friend of Dr. Blake, and like a little brother to me. And he was soon to be the men's minister for the Metropolitan AME Church here in the nation's capital. He has a rich background, which you will learn about much more about today. Let us turn within for opening prayer and reflection. The words of Martin Luther King, World House vision, have pretty much guided us through the formation of the events of today and the speakers and what we hope to focus on. And I will open by reading his words. We have inherited a large house, a great house, world house, in which we have to live together, Black and white, Easterner and Westerner, Gentile and Jew, Catholic and Protestant, Muslim and Hindu, a family unduly separated in ideas, culture, and interests. Because we can never live again, because we can never live apart, must learn somehow to live with each other in peace. God of all people, architect of this great world house, bless the work we do here today. Help us to be ever mindful that mutual accountability through you is the glue that binds us together in this great world house, expressed through the highest values with the common threads of reverence, peace, compassion, justice, joy, forgiveness, and charity, which we adhere to and to manifest in all we do. We ask that you energize our minds, our hearts, and our spirits so we leave here today renewed and restoring the memory of a lost harmony, as Dr. Thurman would say, where we can all achieve wholeness and fulfillment and build a beloved community, which is the ultimate reality. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Claire Nelson, the organizer, to go over the day's events and begin the panels and speeches and so forth. Dr. Nelson.
Thank you so much, Rev, for getting us started, and thanks everyone for joining us on this, I would like to say, auspicious occasion. Why? Because it's the first year that they're celebrating the 4th of February as the International Day of Human Fraternity. We have for a long time, I think, been celebrating the first week of February as World Interfaith Harmony Week. But in 2019, as a result of a conversation between the Pope and the Grand Imam, there was a move towards pushing towards a specific day to kind of focus our attention and focus the world's attention on this idea of moving to, as they put it, in the United Nations system, tolerance, interreligious, and intercultural dialogue. And so after a year of conversation between 2019, on December in 2020, the UN General Assembly did adopt the resolution declaring the 4th of February as the International Day of Human Fraternity, and the cooperation needed to promote peace, harmony, and intercultural dialogue in the world. Now, I must say that this was started by, the Pope Francis and the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, but the signing also include Jewish members and in the higher committee that was formed at the United Nations. And so we can anticipate that the entire world community of other faiths that were not present in that time will no doubt be joining this as we move forward into the future. But it's so important, I think, for us to begin this year in particular, given the state in which we as a human family find ourselves in this, what I call holy transition between what was and what is yet to be and what we would like to see. And so this conversation, which is about building world community through our faith and focusing on spiritual, ethical, and moral leadership, is really a vital conversation. Many of us in this movement are in our real day-to-day lives are also involved in activism. And we like to say we're moving towards a more sacred form of activism. And so the vision for us is really to explore how the faith community can help to reset and co-create our tenets to help leaders respond to the complex challenges and the chaos of the systems in which we are embedded, while remaining true to our respective faiths. And this is just an opportunity to begin this dialogue, to be more focused on this issue of spiritual, ethical, and moral leadership as it affirms to the people at the global space, in the global commons, the national commons, where we are in America dealing with some major challenges, and of course at the local level. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the moderator for this session, who will be having a fireside chat with Reverend Dorsey and Reverend Jay. And it is Mr. J.Jioni Palmer. He is the CEO of Thinking Good. I love that name. It's a digital media community that helps men to be their better selves, better husbands, fathers, sons, brothers, friends, entrepreneurs, innovators, artists, thinkers. He has a distinguished technical and historical past as the former press secretary of the Congressional Black Caucus, as well as he has also served as an associate commissioner of external affairs in the Social Security Administration. So he knows about leadership and governance at a very high levels. And he's also, in his spiritual life, the men's minister at Metropolitan AME Church here in Washington, D.C. So I give the floor to soon to be Dr. Palmer, who will take us through the next hour or so in conversation with Reverend Dorsey Blake and Reverend James Speights. So the floor is yours, Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson, for that wonderful introduction. The appointment to be the minister advisor to the men of Metropolitan is in process, so it hasn't been officially, announced to the full congregation, but it has been to the leadership of, the men of the church, and I'm deeply humbled and honored that I have been called to serve in that capacity by my pastor, William H. Lamar IV. And thank you, Reverend Dr. Speights, His Royal Highness, Prince Vatikan Deka. We will talk about that, I'm sure, in greater detail. And of course, it is an honor to be here with you, Dr. Blake, who, I don't know, for those of you who were on in the beginning, he was a friend and mentor and a big brother to my mother. And she speaks of him with high reverence and regard, although they haven't sort of, I guess, been in physical proximity in quite a number of years. But every now and then she tells me about their email correspondence and whatnot. So it is an honor. I'll obviously have great respect for our speakers, but since we went over some of the bios at the beginning, I won't do the full lengthy presentation of their bios, but this conversation here is going to be with Reverend Dr. J. Speights, who is a pastor, chaplain, author, producer, spiritual coach, and a community builder. As he mentioned, he's the executive director of the new Seminary for Interfaith Studies in New York, and he is currently working on his third book, I Am. Hashtag I Am. Let me not forget that, since it's very important.
You can tell him. You can tell him. You can tell him.
The hashtag was my idea. Everything else is his. And it is based on his recent trip to Benin, West Africa, where he connected through DNA testing with his ancestral royal family and was enthroned and declared Prince Vatikan Deka of the Kingdom of Alada. And he's also working to bring a biopic of the life of civil rights icon Fannie Lou Hamer to the big screen. And our other participant in this conversation is the Reverend Dr. Dorsey Odell Blake, who is a faculty associate, leadership and social transformation. He was officially installed as the presiding minister of the Church for the Fellowship of All People in October 1994. During Dr. Blake's installation service, Mrs. Sue Bailey Thurman presented Dr. Howard Thurman's robes, which had not been worn since his death, to Dr. Blake as a symbol of her trust in his leading the congregation, quote, so that there will be no past greater than our future, end quote. So I have a couple of questions here. Thank you all, both Dr. Speights and Dr. Blake, but also all of you here joining us. I see a lot of friendly faces. I only see one familiar face. Actually, that's not true. There's two, Michael Lohr and Reverend Julianne. So thank you all for being here. I just kind of want to, I want to start big, right? We're talking about the global, community, and, on some of the promotional material here, there was a question. So I'm going to put that out to you all. What does your faith teach about the interdependence of one to another and responsibility to community and justice versus the law of the land?
Reverend Blake, Dr. Blake, you could go first.
Well, first of all, can you hear me okay? Because I understand I'm going in and out at times. Is this volume all right?
Yep, I can hear you.
Yes.
Okay, fine. First of all, I just want to say one thing about J.Jioni Palmer. His mother, Sherry, was in the very first class I ever taught. It was a class on Black Studies, and it was at the Lutheran High School that she attended. Again, I was sort of thrown into that situation, and it was a grand time for me. At the installation service, when I received Dr. Thurman's robe, I was wiped out. What happened was, at the end, I was in a doctorate ministry program at United Seminary in Dayton, and I had lost my job at the Center for Urban Black Studies at the GTU, and I did not know what to do. But we had scheduled this installation service, and she asked me what robe was I going to wear, and I told her I really didn't have one or whatever, and she mentioned Dr. Thurman's robe, that she wanted to give that to me. Well, that was nice, and I thought, but I did not realize the impact when she came out with the robe and said at the very end of her presentation, and this robe has not been worn since Howard's death. And they put the robe on me. And I'm a person who can talk, but it totally wiped me out. I tried to go to the podium to thank her and other people, and no word would come out. Seriously, I opened my mouth. There was nothing came out. So I moved away and said, take 3 deep breaths, calm yourself, and go back. So I did all of that, and I went back to thank people, to thank her, and again, nothing could come out. It happened that in the congregation was a friend who had gone to seminary with me, although he was at San Francisco Theological Seminary while I was at Pacific School of Religion. Lawrence Lakey was his name. And Lawrence and my former secretary were in the congregation on different sides. And I guess they somehow looked at each other and decided that they needed to come and help me. So they came and they held me one on one side, one on the other, so all the tears could come and everything else. And I tried to figure out what that was about. And I think part of it was the fact that Dr. Thurman embodies so much of what we're discussing today. His life was committed, totally committed to understanding each other as brother, sister, interfaith understanding. And that was the basis of the church, actually. The church was not, we never asked anybody what their theology was. The question was, bring yourself. Bring yourself. And if you bring yourself, and we can have profound religious experiences over a significant period of time, it will develop among us a sense of common ground, a sense of unity that will destroy all the barriers, the socially imposed barriers that exist. So that was the basis of the building of the church. So my interfaith understanding has been with me for a long, long time. It did not start with Dr. Thurman, but he embodied it so very much. And I will talk later about how we have tried to continue that legacy. But the other person who helped me with my own faith understanding was the person that Dr. J quoted at the very beginning, Martin Luther King and his World House. But prior to that, I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. King my junior year in seminary, not seminary, in college at Brown University. And it was one of the most extraordinary experiences I've had, prior to the robe. And he embodied, I think, what the 8th century prophets embodied, as far as I'm concerned. He was a 20th century prophet. And he looked like his train filled the temple. And when it was over, I went to talk with him. And he said, and I found out, first of all, in the temple, he looked like he was just huge. Again, his train filled the temple. And then when I met him after the service, I'm going, hey, he's a little dude. He's only like 5'7". I'm going, I don't believe this, I don't believe this. He's shorter than I am, this is this kind of thing. But he embodied too this understanding that the world cannot survive. We have the choice of chaos or community, and we must work for what he called community. And he said in a couple of his speeches that this means not only the world house, but this is an ecumenical endeavor. There's not, and he used the word ecumenical at that time, but he also said Jewish, which means also interfaith. It's an interfaith endeavor that we must undertake in order to bring about this beloved community. So to answer part of your question, my faith understanding was developed in a great sense by Dr. King, because I believe so much in him. And after meeting him, I realized that whatever my life, whatever direction it took, and I wasn't sure of ministry at the time, it had to complement what he was doing. It had to follow along the lines that he had outlined in terms of his own life. And since his life was one of moving beyond Christianity to accept people and work with people beyond Christianity, mine had to do the same thing. And of course, Dr. Thurman. So it was very natural, I think, for Mrs. Thurman, after some years at the church, with some difficulties, financial difficulties and other difficulties, Mrs. Thurman actually asked me to come to the church, the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples. It was, she was very, very special, and I hope one of these days somebody will do something. It might have been the Howard Thurman that we know and love without Sue Bailey Thurman, and he said that himself. So that's part of my interfaith understanding of the work. Secondly, just quickly, we came into being just 1 year before the United Nations. And so there was that kind of relationship also when all these nations came together in 1945 in San Francisco. And one person was Elder Roosevelt. Elder Roosevelt gave a dinner party for the Thurmans before they left Washington to come to San Francisco. And she was an initial member, a member at large at the church. In her faith understanding to the United Nations and played an integral part.
You're breaking up a little bit, Dr. Blake.
Okay. Let me see. She played an integral part. Is this better?
That's much better.
No. Okay, she played an integral part in the development of the United Nations the year after Fellowship Church came into being.
And that name, I missed it. You were talking, that was Mrs. Sue Blake, Bailey Thurman.
Yes, very, very important. The person I was talking about at that time, Mrs. Thurman, was actually part of a delegation to the United Nations. Okay. But it was Eleanor Roosevelt that I was talking about, who also participated in the founding of the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples by giving a dinner, and she was an initial member of the church, as well as her role in the development of the United Nations.
Thank you. Dr. Speights, I don't know if you need me to, repeat the question.
Could you? Yeah.
Conversation. Pardon me?
I was so interested in what Dr. Blake was saying. I forgot the question. I'm lost back at the robes. That's powerful. Yeah, go ahead.
The essence of the question is, what does your faith teach about the interdependence we all have with one another and a responsibility to community and justice versus to the rule of the land?
Well, let me start by saying, as the executive director of the new seminary, I often speak about that, and I try to help the students understand this, even though they have their own faith traditions, but to step into an expanded sense of that, of their tradition in an ecumenical context. It is in that context that I call what we do and what governs and informs my life as a liberating form of spirituality. And that I see diversity as a blessing and focus on the wholeness and completeness of the individual through our community, where they can really eat from the spiritual buffet that is before us in the terms of all the traditions of the world, and look at and glean from among the sacred texts, rites, rituals, teachings, and offerings, and live their lives in accordance with the divine threads that I call peace, justice, compassion, forgiveness, understanding, and charity. Dr. Blake, I have stretched beyond the limits of conformity to a particular tradition. And I think that that's where Dr. Thurman was. And that was easy for me to do because I was raised, well, my mother was Catholic and she was strict. We went to Catholic school. And then in the summer, when we packed off and went to Florida, my father was AME, and we became AME, J.Jioni in the summer, and both very strict. We adhere to both traditions in a very strict sense. And I think that helped inform who I am a lot, because in addition to that, my mother would read the existential poets to us as a form of spirituality, in a way, in a lens to look at life. And so, and she would also read people like Edgar Cayce and Nostradamus. So she said, well, I want you to listen to what you're learning in Catholicism and in the AME church, but also to have your own mind and an open mind to the other traditions and expressions of spirituality in the world. But I've arrived at a place where, I see the religious experience as a common ground. And what do I mean by that? The religious or the spiritual experience ought to provide for the wholeness and completeness of each individual to live their life in pursuit of their wholeness, their fullness, their unique purpose and mission, and to bring their unique skills and gifts to the world. And when you do that, and if you're really and truly on your path, then you build the beloved community, the community where all people can live in harmony and peace. And they're so busy being them, the as me person that God created, that they don't have time to worry about what somebody else is doing and how they relate to God. I think Dr. Thurman said, Dr. Blake, I always wanted to be me without making it uncomfortable to be you.
Right.
And I think that he was saying that we ought to be ourselves. And if we are truly ourselves without prescription, meaning without living by prescription through the dictates and mandates of somebody else, we have a wholeness and completeness that generates and emanates the divine presence. Now, if all faith traditions pull together for the purpose of the beloved community and focus on the threads that unite us and mutual accountability as the glue that holds us together, then that community impacts government. And the output of government is for the common good, the higher good, for the best of all, as opposed to what we have today, where we have the faith and spiritual communities living under what I call the paradigm of enemy thinking, that I'm absolutely right. And if you don't believe what I believe in, then you're absolutely wrong. And this difference divides us. And it's the basis for how we interact. And nowhere can that be more evident today than in the United States and globally. The enemy paradigm is very much the standard business of the day. Yes. And so faith communities must start at a very fundamental place of mutual accountability of the universal threads that build the beloved community.
Brother Palmer, could I just comment a little bit more in terms of what I said before? I got so carried away myself with Thurman and King. They sometimes send me to Speights, and it's hard to come back to where I want to be. I said that Dr. King appeared to me to be a prophet, like the 8th century prophets and Hebrew prophets. What prophets did was they interrupted. Okay, they interrupted the things the way they were. They made it clear that what existed was not what God intended, that the antagonism, the exploitation, the economic deprivation, those things were against the will of God. So they always interrupted and called for something very, very different. They were people who said there's another reality for which we must strive and choose. And that's part of the, and King talked too about the fact that you can't just talk about justice. We have a responsibility, interfaith people, to work for justice. Even in his letter to Birmingham jail, he talks so seriously about progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It only comes about through the hard work of people who are committed themselves to justice. So part of the interfaith responsibility is, in fact, to help envision what ought to be and work to make sure what ought to be can be, as Harry Emerson said. There are examples. I think also, well, maybe that it is important for us to, at times when you're in the majority religion, in particular situations, even in interfaith councils, to be particularly sensitive to those who are not part of the majority religion. And here, because what happens, one of the problems I think of interfaith understanding is that a lot of times people from the minority faith feel as though they cannot really be honest about what is bothering them or whatever, because they're trying to cooperate with people of the dominant religion. And so it's hard sometimes for them to be as blunt or to say no as whatever, because of this need to feel a sense of harmony. And so I think it's important as we try to deal with society to understand that we often put at a disadvantage those who are of minority religions who are trying to work even in interfaith circles.
Thank you. So my head's swirling with a lot of thoughts and ideas, and just listening to this conversation. But one of the things I believe is that if religion ain't revolution, then you're just getting high, right? Exactly. That if it's just about praise and worship, then smoke a joint, pour out some liquor, something like that, right? Or do whatever, maybe it's dancing. There's some other releases, yes. a form of getting high, right? So to me, if religion is revolution, what that means is that it's transformative, yes. right? Not just changing you from the, inwardly, but outwardly, and how you relate to people, how you relate to communities, and all of this other kind of stuff. So with that in mind, I believe, right, that my purpose here is to push us all beyond sort of like the abstract and the esoteric, right? And sort of like, how can we do that spade work of building the beloved community? But before we can actually do that, the question I have, right? Like, all right, bring yourself. Let's not worry about, the theologies, but there are theologies in this country,
yes,
right, that are destructive, right? Yes. That marginalize people, that oppress people, and there are theologies that gave the legal justification for slavery, for the enslavement, right? There are theologies that support denying people health care, right? Mass incarceration. So, and to me, the theologies of a Paula White or a Jerry Falwell Jr. are violent to people that look like me, right? And people who don't look like me, but are marginalized, right? And so, for instance, Dr. Blake, you lifted up Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, which was so, brilliant, because he flipped, thousands of years of theological thinking and applied it. But that letter, as you know, was written to clergy. He was going at the religious leaders, those moderate to conservative, like, well, in due time. So, I guess what I'm saying is how do we put this all into practice? How do we operationalize it? Right? When we have, theologies that aren't just up here or in someone's heart, but that are put into practice in ways that are so destructive.
Well, I think first of all, we have to question theologies and realize that theology itself is a Western Christian concept and discipline. Many people, indigenous people, did not talk in terms of theology, but they talked about the creator. Many people just had experiences in some of the traditional Africans, just experiences which were very meaningful to them. So one of our problems is that theology itself can be an imposition on religious experience, religious phenomena. So that's part of the problem with theology. So we have to we have to look at theology as not as absolute, and that the theology must come out of the communities of the peoples. And so that's why you have the very beautiful concept, also Seminary, James Cone comes in Black theology, theology of liberation, which shook the theological world. To go back to what you're saying, because they had a particular concept of theology. And when he started talking about theology and Black power being related, it just blew the top off of the seminaries, okay? So then you have the feminist movement, then the womanist theology, queer theology, all these things where people are saying, this is where I'm coming from. So one of the things that we have to do is that we have to build a strong enough movement that the theologies of oppression cannot survive in terms of the people. That's the problem, okay? And we can do that. We can do that. And the reason I'm saying we can do that, if you look at where we are right now with all of these problems, we are not where we were before, and we're not where we were before because of people, particularly religious people, said no. You look at the people involved in the abolitionist movement, the civil rights movement, women, all these, a small minority of people gathered and said, we're going to commit our lives to a different reality. And so they put forth. So all of us have benefited from that. 70 years ago, we would not be talking about liberation theology, or whatever, 80 years ago, or womenist theology or ethics. We would not. So I think the other thing is that we have a responsibility as religious leaders to call out scriptures that are considered sacred, which are abusive. And in my tradition, coming out of the Judeo-Christian, there are a lot of abusive scriptures, which I don't use. And if I use them, is to critique them in terms of how they are oppressing. They are part of the oppressive structures. They are part of imperialism, and those things have to be challenged. So,
amen. Dr.
Thank
Speights?
you. First, I think we have to unmute the voice of God. That often gets lost in the dialogue. It's lost in the dialogue. We now have prophets that assume the face of God and the voice of God, and thus God is muted. And the word of God is expressed, as I said earlier, in these common threads. And the common threads have been, there's a shift away from the common threads of peace, justice, joy, happiness, compassion, and charity for the true meaning of how those concepts are to be applied in the beloved community and society, to a value placed on who and what the person looks like, what they earn, where they live, where they come from, and a whole set of other factors that take away, and I want you to get this, the voice and face of people. We see them, tend to see them in terms of demographics: a poor person, a Black person, a member of the LGBT community. We have to give a voice and face to everybody first. And this is fundamental work and foundational work that needs to be done by all faith communities. And there needs to be a reexamination of what you can call the corporate church. The corporate church, where churches become more of a business instead of a community to nurture and help people achieve their wholeness and completion. Why are there so many vacant churches in major cities? Or because they follow the money.
Yes.
They follow the money. And when I was at Wesley Seminary, a woman told us that until they moved, their church made the decision, an inner city church, to close the doors and not allow any strangers or new people in. Because they had a community where they all looked alike, they spoke alike. Right. Again, this is enemy thinking. If you don't look like I look,
read, Matthew 25, the judgment of the sheep and the goats, right?
Yes. You want to expound on that?
Yeah.
I mean, that's where Jesus says that, when I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. Or in my version, when I was hungry, you gave me some bread. When I was thirsty, you bought me a big gulp. When I moved to the neighborhood, you brought me a pie. And when I was in jail for selling a dime bag of weed while corporations made billions off of opioids, you set me free.
Mm.
That's the judgment.
Very well said.
And then they all say, they all turn around. Well, when did we see the leader of the revolution shoeless, in threadbare clothes, hungry, and in prison? And Jesus says, no, when you did it for the least of these, you did it for me.
Very well said. Dr. Blake, that quote, we have to take the patriarchy out of how we see the other, out of the fullness of my cup I give to you. And therefore, since I can give to you out of the fullness of my cup, then I can dictate who and how you're to live in this society. I prescribe a life for you and assign a value to you as a lesser. And that's contrary.
Right.
Yeah. Contrary to the Spirit of God, contrary to the threads that run through society. You're right. Jesus said, what you do for the least of these.
And there are examples, again, great examples of how that happened. For example, Dorothy Day. And many people wonder, why would she accept all the people that came to the Catholic worker? And she said, whenever I see somebody, I see Christ. How can I turn anybody away? I don't care what their conditions are. I see Christ. It would be like turning Christ away. And so that was something that she really felt and believed. And she communicated that to those in the Dorothy Day houses and all her work. That is what I'm talking about. And Brother Palmer, what you talk about is so good because it makes us realize that, and there are many ways we have to minister to those who are sick. There are a lot of people who are sick, physically sick, and they're sick because of internalized impression, their own oppression is setting them free also. Many people who are locked in their own captivity because they bought what they cannot do. They've been commodified and they accept their commodification, which means they've accepted something much lesser than who they really are and who they were intended to be. So those who help, just like where we're gathered here today, hopefully to help somebody along the way, to see a better possibility, to see out of the mess that we are in, some kind of future and can help us move forward. Those are the people. Again, when the king says, well, when did we see you, Jesus? When you did this. To that person on the street, to that child who was failing in your classroom, and you helped them to understand that they were not dumb, and helped to work with them so they could become somebody, you did it to me. And so I think that for us, let me just say, coming out of my tradition, it is always a struggle to be the embodiment of that beloved community, that kingdom idea, KINDOM idea, that we have to really struggle with.
The beloved community is more than a vision. It can be a reality. And it's the ultimate reality because a community provides the safe, verdant pasture for you to grow and to nurture. And as the commercial says, to be all you can be. That's really what God wants for everybody, for you to be all you can be, not to live by the prescriptions of other people, but in accordance with the God of your heart, the God that you know. When I was in Catholic school, I would listen to what a lot of what the nuns and priests would say, and I would take the test and pass the catechism, quizzes and everything. And then I'd go home and I'd say, I don't believe half of what I just wrote down.
Right.
And, Chaplain Alan Siegel, when I was training in CPE to be a chaplain, and Dr. Blake, when I would have to do end of life service and pray over someone, it always occurred to me, authenticity came into mind.
Yes.
Did this person actually examine the basic tenets of his religion? Because when you meet people in the hospital on the deathbed, a lot of them haven't visited their sacred tenets in a while. A lot of them haven't picked up their sacred texts, but they they revert back to their root faith tradition, whatever that was.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And now you're at the death's door, and it's time for you to assess how you lived and how you govern your life. And a lot of people spend more time in research and buying a car than they do in examining the tenets of their religion to see if they can really adhere to them. And I would like to think that most of the people that are on this line have been stretched to a point where they now feel that they have to look for new answers. They have to look for new wine to put in their new wine skins. Go ahead.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, please go ahead.
But the new wine does have to be put into new wineskin. Part of our problem of people is that we try to put new ideas into old forms, old structures, and it's not going to work. It's going to burst. You have to come up with we spend too much of our lives trying to build on things that are not going to work, things in the past that are not adequate for our future. So we have to build. When you're talking about intentional community, we've actually seen beloved communities. They've existed throughout. The early Christian church was a beloved community, where it used to say it, the people shared whatever they had, they gave it to people who needed it. There have been intentional communities in the United States. One of our problems is, again, our education is lacking in this country, very much lacking. And we don't know about those communities. We don't. But there have been throughout many nice communities that were intentionally responsible and responsive to each other. Even now, when I look at new wineskins, we look at economics. And King was very clear about we have to change the economic structure. I don't want to blow anybody's mind, but he did say the current structure of capitalism cannot produce the beloved community. It cannot, based upon profit and exploitation of the poor. It cannot do it. So we've got to come up with something that's different. And we've seen some people doing co-ops, which have possibilities. They're not going to be automatic, magical changes, but they involve at least the people who are working, being owners, this kind of thing. And there are other structures, other possibilities that we have to envision in terms of people working together. Now, I will say, to a great extent, growing up Black in segregation, we developed alternatives. We developed alternative communities, economics, alternative schools, alternative understanding of who we are, out of the need to. So I'm saying that I love that question about beloved community, and we have already experienced some. We need to go back and understand and learn more about them and how we can be present also in terms of developing beloved community or hints of the kingdom. Yes.
There's a certain honesty that comes with knowing the story of your faith and your faith tradition. And I guess the misinterpretation or misrepresentation of what your tradition is and has been in its place in the world fosters tremendous tension. President Obama received a lot of negative press and comments because he said at one of the national prayer breakfasts that Christians ought not look down their nose at Islam as a violent religion, but they need to understand and go back and look at their history as well. So there has to be an honest dialogue about among faith traditions about who and what they are. They have to know their story. They have to own and claim.
Thank you.
Own and claim their story. And in claiming their story, you can get to a point of an honest dialogue where there are no absolutes, there are no apologetics, and everything is stripped away. All the barriers are removed. And then you can focus on the threads that bind us together, the mutual accountability. I see where someone asked a question, what is mutual accountability? You can say, brother Muslim, you're not living by the sacred tenets. You know, the religious experience, again, ought to put all of us in the same place in our lives, which is pursuit of our wholeness and completion. It ought to take us to that place where we have time and the ability to focus on that. Government is a tool to do that, to provide for a safe way to delivery of services, affordable housing, access to education, healthcare, food. There should be no food deserts. Somebody cannot be all they can be without basic nutrition, without access to education. We need to drive the dialogue. J.Jioni, you would be interested to know, and Reverend Julianne was there, and I see Reverend Dr. Grayson from St. John's, a good friend of mine online. When I worked for Walter Fauntroy as his district office chief of staff, it was under him and Bill Gray that the Congressional Black Caucus introduced the Congressional Black Caucus budget resolution for peace, justice, harmony,
Yes,
and all the tenets of charity, compassion, built into it. Now, it did get defeated, but Julianne, you remember that was quite a spectacle to see what was in under 20 members of the Black Caucus. Imagine that, Congressional Black Caucus, fighting it for and introducing that budget resolution on the floor. And some of them were king lieutenants, like my boss, Reverend Dr. Walter Fauntroy. And to see them fight to do that, take a stand during the Reagan years, was food for my soul. Food for my soul. We knew it would fail, but you have to start somewhere. So we need to drive. The faith community needs to reassert itself. The faith community that calls their adherents to live lives of peace, justice, compassion, and charity. We need to reignite our energy, reignite our mind, body, spirit, and soul, and start driving the dialogue to affect the output of government. And the way we do that, Reverend Grayson, I know you do, Dr. Dorsey, and certainly at Metropolitan AME, is to start with our younger people and provide a base for activism within the community. And surely some of this will catch on with them, and then they start carrying these principles into government. And who knows where that goes. We push them away from this. They're dissuaded in a lot of times because they don't see the output of government as speaking directly to them. And we have to teach them that this is something you have to be vigilant at. You have to watch, you have to reintroduce them to the civil rights movement and how the Black church stepped in and played the role of deliverance for us. And how Dr. King called the clergy, the American clergy, who told him to wait in due time. People like Billy Graham told him, you cannot push this agenda. You have to go slow. No, we can't wait and we won't wait, but we need to show our younger people that faith is the tool to drive the dialogue and output of government.
So I think that a lot of folks, but even people of faith, often have don't see the systems at play, right? And because we are called to be compassionate, I believe that is true, right? We should be, taking food to, the unhoused, or, backpacks and all this other kind of stuff. But many of us, if we're standing on the side of a river and we see a body go by, we're going to run in the river to grab the body out.
Yes.
But then we turn around and another body goes by. So we're spending our time just fetching people out of the river rather than going upstream to figure out why everybody's falling into the river. Right. And I think that our faith should requires us to look upstream.
Yes.
Right? And figure out, where they're going. So when I have two young sons, a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old, and when we're driving, in our city, I point things out to them. I'm like, well, why are there so many people living in tents?
Thank you.
Right here, right?
Yeah.
There's this new area in DC, or they call it it's called Noma, right? North of Massachusetts Avenue. And you go down, it's down by Union Station, and there's all these people sleeping under tents. Well, 10 years ago, before all of these apartment buildings went up at $2,000, $3,000 a month, these were single family homes. The people got pushed out. Most people are homeless in communities where they formerly lived, right? Like, if all of a sudden I found myself homeless, I'm not going to move to some strange city or some strange neighborhood. I'm going to go to a place, where I know, where I've been living. So I helped them to sort of make that connections. And one last thing, we were at this place trying to get get something to eat. And I go to pay with my phone by Apple Pay. And they say, "Oh, I'm sorry, we only take cards." And I said, "But not cash?" "No. We either take cards or online." So I turned to my son, my 9-year-old. I said, "Well, who's excluded? Who can't enjoy this meal that we are about to enjoy because they do not have access to the internet, or they don't have a bank account that comes with a credit card or with a debit card?" There are plenty of people. So I think we need to, look upstream. And I guess my question is, how can we, how do we move in that way intentionally as, people of faith, regardless of our faith traditions?
Well, first of all, I want to say I totally agree with you in terms of moving upstream and dealing with systems. We've got to. It is a crime, and at times I can barely not cry when I drive the streets of Oakland and see all of the people without homes. I mean, I'm going in this city, when I think about in this nation, the number of billionaires and multi-billionaires that we have, the breaks the corporations get, it's just absolutely wrong. And so, yes, I think we've got to work with that system, but are there things for example, Martin Luther King in 1963, I believe, he met with Hyman Bookbinder, who was with the Office of Budget Management, who said, we could end poverty in the United States if the rich would agree to become even richer, but at a slower pace. He said later it would take about $30 billion per year to end. But look at how much we spend in terms of military. It's easily done. We could end poverty. It's just we don't have the will. And I think part of the interfaith, I'm challenging interfaith community. I mean, I appreciate what we've done, but there's some things that we must do. I don't know why the interfaith community cannot put together a vision and also a program to say these are the things that must be done from our various faith traditions. One is to end poverty, end war. How do we deal with those? Are big issues. But I think until they're put out there and people really begin to work on them, they're not going to change. We have Martin Luther King again. People, I'm sorry, and I regret what we have done to him. And part of it has been the fact of the Martin Luther King holiday. So many people take that as a holiday. They even don't talk about at times it's a Martin Luther King parade instead of a march, those kinds of things. He said in 1967, he, along with A. Philip Randolph and Byron Rustin, they put together a freedom budget. And in that freedom budget, and this was for people to look at, interfaith communities. So in that freedom budget, he said people need a guaranteed annual income. We've dropped that idea. Why have we dropped that idea? And if people can't work, they need to be taken care of. We're talking about now, and it came out in the last election, we did talk about dropping these student debts. Why can't the internet community say this is an abomination to saddle young people with this kind of debt, which they will never be able to pay, which will force them, many of them, into jobs that they don't want, but they pay better than the job that their heart tells them they ought to have? Well, these are some of the things that interfaith people could come from our own faith perspective. Is there a faith perspective that says poverty is good? Or we should have more wars? No. So these are some of the tenets of our faith traditions. Why won't we bring those forward and say, this is what, and so what I'm saying, I think it is important to work with government. And at the same time, I'm saying that we can do some things ourselves. There's interfaith communities beyond government. Look at how much money there are in so many of the faith traditions. The churches, for example, I know those best. There's money there. Again, when you go back to segregation, days of segregation, black people put together schools, insurance companies, all these kinds of things, which were not done by the government, but done by the community, often the church.
Looks like Dr. Blake has frozen, and he
I am.
will be okay.
Okay.
Oh, he's back.
Okay. So, Brother Palmer, again, your question is an essential question with which the interfaith community, how do we deal with the oppressive systems that consign people to oppression?
I think we have to be in awe of who we are and understand who we are and what. The Pew Research polls, that annual survey, the survey that they do every so many years, when you look at what they call the unchurched and the nuns, they're maybe a percentage point or two behind evangelicals and Catholics, almost 32% of the population. Now, since my background is political, I look at numbers and I claim those numbers. I claim that most of those people are the folks that have been stretched that by traditional communities, and they are using this poll to express that. But if you ask them in person, they'll say, well, I belong to usually the root tradition that they were born into. But if you take that 32% of the United States population and let them understand that it's okay to say that you have moved more into a global vision of spirituality, and that global vision has to come to bear on the political system, then you can start to make real change. I think we're intimidated by the more established traditions, and the institutions really stand up and say who and what we are. I tell my students, never say you're an interfaith minister, say you're a minister. Same God that put the burning desire, divine service in that person's heart, that minister's heart, put it in your heart. And let me give you an example of how the faith community can impact and change public policy and enrich. Going back to my former boss, Walter Fauntroy, first congressman from DC. J.Jioni, if you look at the churches downtown Washington, maybe going down in the Southwest, going uptown, and up 16th Street and Shaw and those neighborhoods, you'll notice that most of the subway stops are around Black, formerly historic Black churches. Did you ever notice that?
Yep.
Because my boss was head of something called MECO, which was a economic development body that was part of the DC government and maybe the Council of Governments in the area. And he strategically had, when they were developing Metro, had these major stops placed near Black churches to build Black businesses based off the church's presence in that community. And that's back when people actually went to church in their community and, not, community church. Understanding who we are, understanding our power, understanding the political process, and not being intimidated by the groups that seem to get most of the news, that seem to have most of the money. And you touched on it, Dr. Blake. We have to make our money work for us too. We have to start fielding our own candidates. Our own candidates that believe in the beloved community, that truly believe in the beloved community, and play an active role in their political organizations and present an agenda to them based on what we like to see enacted and what we would like to see put into law to uplift, everybody.
So our time has come to an end. This has been our time for this session has come to an end, and I have to go to my pastoral care practicum class, which started at 4:00. But my professor knows that I was going to be running a little late. This was a rich and wonderful, conversation. There are a lot of different things that I could say to feebly attempt to sum up everything that I'm feeling, but I'd like to lift up a quote from a great book that I read, Exchanging Our Country's Marks by Gusto Gonzalez, who is a historian, a church historian, and he says, if we are to break free from an undue bondage to tradition, we must begin by understanding what that tradition is, how we came to be where we are, and how particular elements in our past color our view of the present. It is then that we are free to choose which elements in the past and in the present we wish to reject and which we will affirm. Thank you all for this conversation and dialogue, and look forward to connecting with you all again sometime soon.
Thank you, J.Jioni, and Dr. Blake. It's been an honor to share this with you, and thank you for bringing your presence, as well as the presence of Dr. Thurman into this.